Director Peters, we're approaching the 1 year anniversary of your appointment as director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So, how is it going? You've been in the job for almost a year. How are you feeling about it?
I'm feeling really good about it. In some ways, it feels like that was just yesterday. And in other ways, it feels like I've been with the Bureau for years. And I mean that in a really positive way. I feel like I've become a part of the Bureau family and that we've made really great strides in the last 10 plus months.
You've been in your role for almost a year as the director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. What have your biggest challenges been?
Coming into this role, I knew what some of the biggest challenges would be. Staffing was at the top of the list. We had a staffing crisis before the pandemic. Then the pandemic happened. We lost so many people. Then the economy changed, as you know, across our country, and views of law enforcement changed. And so our ability to recruit has been really difficult. It was a crisis before the pandemic, and it continues. So we've been working diligently to shore up our staffing issues. As you know, we also had concerns around sexual misconduct inside our institutions, specifically some of our female institutions. So we've been working really hard with the Department of Justice at our side to tackle those issues. Being more transparent with members of the media, with members of Congress. And so we've been spending the last 10 months really trying to open those doors and build those relationships and helping the world see the good parts of the Bureau and not just those negative headlines that they were plagued with for so many years.
We'll get back to some of the challenges in a moment, but I'm curious, what drew you to this kind of work?
I knew early on that I wanted to be in a helping field. I have this vague, not this vague memory, this real memory in kindergarten, actually, where this individual came in, he had a knife in his pocket. The teacher carried him out like a football and under her arm and marched him to the principal's office. And I thought to myself, I need to help him. And
Wait, a
we
kid in kindergarten brought a knife to school?
Yes. Yeah, just a little pocket knife. But of course, they took it very seriously, and we became friends over the years. And in high school, I was able to take a criminal justice class and a psychology course, and that really framed kind of the direction that I wanted to head into. And then my undergraduate degree was really rich with experiences grounded in principles of Benedictine values that really helped kind of frame my desire to become a public servant and to really help those who are justice involved. And now I've had the privilege of doing it for over 30 years.
Your first job was at a youth corrections facility, and I'm curious what lessons you took away from that initial encounter with young offenders.
It was a really fantastic experience. It was at a maximum security facility in Johnston, Iowa, working with kids like the one I described in kindergarten who made mistakes along the way that became more serious over time. But they were still kids, and they were kids with hopes and dreams and wanting a positive future. And following that experience, I worked for Breck Prep School, which was a really influential prep school in Minneapolis. And the juxtaposition between the two was fascinating for me. When I was working in Iowa, I had kids who brought knives to school or brought drugs to school, and law enforcement was called for those individuals. At the prep school, resources were brought in, psychologists were brought in, chaplains were brought in, parents were brought in. Wraparound resources really were there for those kids. And that left a really significant mark for me around really kind of increasing my desire to help people who are justice involved.
As you know, many people think mass incarceration is one of the legacies of systemic racism that has existed in our country for a very long time. And I'm curious how you're approaching that as the director of prisons and looking at this issue to try to correct what many people see as, an extension of racism in this country.
Yeah, I cannot argue with that. I think that's actually factually accurate, and it's something that I'm very passionate about. I think you have to go at it at two different ways. I think there needs to be changes to our sentencing laws. There needs to be changes to who comes to prison and for how long. And then I think corrections actually has a role to play. We need to make sure that the jobs that we have inside our institutions are available to everyone, so that there isn't a disproportionate minority impact there. We need to ensure that through our changes to restrictive housing, that there's not a disproportionate minority impact there. So we have our part to do here inside, and then there needs to be changes systematically to the criminal justice system, from arrest to conviction to incarceration and release, as it relates to systemic racism.
So you need to have more Black employees in the prison system.
So there is a lot of research out there that says if you can relate to the individual you're working with, you're more likely to engage in reform. And so you hit on another topic. We need to hire the most diverse workforce that we can. Now, the wonderful thing about the Federal Bureau of Prisons is we are scattered across this country. And so our ability to hire throughout the country exists, and I think opens that door to being able to hire the most diverse workforce out there in law enforcement. And so that is certainly our goal. And we have a great team in HR that works towards that every single day.
You advocate a more humane approach, but there are plenty of critics out there who call it hug a thug, and really disagree with that philosophy. How do you react to those criticisms?
I hear them loud and clear. Many of those individuals are victims themselves. And if you've ever been a victim of a crime, it is the worst thing that could possibly ever happen to you. And so I'm very empathetic to that viewpoint, and also want to spend time with those individuals talking about some of the things that we've talked about already today, that the research now tells us that we really can create a more humane and normal environment, which will mean safer prisons and better reentry, which means, again, fewer victims created when they leave. And so it is a philosophy that's backed by research and data, and one I really believe strongly in.
You bring up a good point about recidivism, which is often very high for people who have served time in prison. What can be done to give recently released inmates more support so they can integrate back into society with more than a bus ticket? I mean, how can we help with job training and other aspects of support that will help these people go back and not recommit crimes?
There are so many things. I think the first thing we need to do is we need to change the public's view of these individuals when they come back to us. That was the biggest paradigm shift that I saw in Norway. When we talked to citizens in Norway, they talked very openly about how they loved their correction system because they created good neighbors. If I walked to the local coffee shop on the corner and just said, "Who here loves your correction system?" There wouldn't be anyone who raised their hands, right? And so really creating an environment in this country where we're responsible for our neighbors, we're responsible for that reentry. I think that cultural shift is one we need to engage in. And I think it happens through conversations like the one you and I are having right now. But we also know what research suggests. The fact that the Federal Bureau of Prisons has access to residential reentry centers is fantastic. Having that step-down unit in the community with some safety nets, some wraparound services is so important. But you and I both know much of this criminality was created because of mental health issues and alcohol and drug issues, and even lack of housing in the community is an absolute crisis in this country, as you are well aware of. And so if we were even to be able to focus on those three categories and ensure that they had a home when they left our care and custody, and real access to medical, mental health, and alcohol and drug addiction treatment, the notion of a recidivism drop would be a reality.
I know the vast majority of prisoners in this country are in state institutions. Only 150,000 or so are in federal prisons, but I believe 1.1 million or something like that, or even close to 1.2 million are in state institutions. What is the difference between federal and state prisons? And do you have any oversight over the state prisons where the vast majority of inmates currently reside?
So previously, in my last role as the director of the Oregon Department of Corrections, I had oversight, of course, of all of the state prisons that are in the state of Oregon. Currently, in my role today, I don't have oversight over those state institutions, but my hope is at the Federal Bureau of Prisons, as we engage in strategic planning and create a new future for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, our hope is that we lead the way and that state corrections look to us, to our policies and our practices on how we engage with adults in custody. The difference between who goes where is who prosecutes them. If they're prosecuted at the state level by the district attorney, they likely will then go to state prison. And here at the federal level, it's the U.S. attorneys prosecuting those federal felonies. And that results in their incarceration at the Federal Bureau of Prisons.
Let's talk about some of the things you're hoping to do at the federal level that may have a trickle down effect at the state level when it comes to the culture that you're trying to create in federal prisons.
I think we've embarked on an exploration of what state corrections are doing. So our executive team has kind of scattered across the state to explore some of the best practices in state corrections. So I actually hope it's more of a circle, that we're able to steal some ideas from state corrections, share some of the great things the Federal Bureau of Prisons has already been doing for years, and that we open up our doors more to that line of communication and information and idea sharing. But at the Federal Bureau of Prisons, some of the things that we've already been talking about is creating a better environment inside these institutions for those that work there and for those that live there. And so now that we're kind of pivoting out of the pandemic, we've spent a lot of time kind of focusing more at the 40,000 foot level, doing some strategic planning. Where do we want to go? We've relooked at our mission, our vision, our values, and while our mission, the core of our mission will never dramatically change because it has to be safety and security inside of our institutions and then really good re-entry. We are changing some of the nomenclature that I think matter. And we're using words like normalcy and humanity, creating a new core value of compassion, just words that aren't typical in corrections. And yet I think those types of words really can have an influence on boots on the ground and how we interact both with each other in terms of those interactions and with those in our care and custody.
Can you tell me about some of the programs that you think are really effective that you would like to either emulate that are being done at the state level, or things that you would like to put into place that you hope will have a ripple effect throughout the system?
Yeah, there are so many. I mean, the Federal Bureau of Prisons has some excellent evidence-based programs around residential alcohol and drug treatment programs, non-residential alcohol and drug treatment programs, cognitive therapy. I think all of those evidence-based programs we already share with the states, that they're already engaging in those activities. For me, it's really a desire to really change that environment and change how we interact with those in our care and custody. Of course, safety and security is top of mind. That is number one, absolutely. But as we explore other correction systems like that in Norway, we've learned that a more humane interaction, daily interaction, can actually have a greater impact than even those evidence-based programs.
We'll talk about Norway in a moment because I know you traveled there. But one thing that I think people don't realize is that prisons often are a de facto healthcare system for many inmates, isn't it?
Absolutely. We are the de facto mental health hospital in this country. We are the de facto medical facility in the country for so many of these individuals that come to us. And this might be a fascinating statistic for you, but they actually come to us 10 years older biologically than their chronological age because of their lifestyle choices, their lack of preventative care. And so we have people who really need medical assistance and really need that mental health assistance. And it's truly my belief in many cases, if they had gotten that sort of assistance beforehand, victims could have been prevented. And so if we can get them that assistance while they're here, again, I think that reentry they'll be so much better off.
That begs the question, should these prisoners be incarcerated at all if their core issue is drug addiction or mental health problems? And I'm curious how you feel about that.
I think given the crimes that they've committed and the way our justice system is created in this country, absolutely, they needed some form of accountability. There's no doubt about it. I think I go further upstream and think, imagine if they were able to get the medical treatment or the mental health treatment before they engaged in criminality. And so for me, I feel like we need to live in two worlds right now. We need to live in this world where we do have many people incarcerated, and I believe we actually have engaged in over incarceration in this country. And we need to work to really get those front end services available so we can stop the pipeline and we can make sure that people are getting the health care that they need so that they don't create that victim and don't need to come to prison.
You mentioned working in Oregon, Director Peters, where you were director of the Oregon Department of Corrections. When you worked in Oregon, you were known to have a more human-centered approach, which came to be known as the Oregon Way. Can you tell me some of the things that you did at the state level that you are interested in implementing at the federal level?
Yes, well, we knew we had to do something differently. When I became director, we had 6 employee suicides in an 18-month period. And so we had 2 universities come in and study the issue, both on the medical side and on the mental health side. And the data points were terrifying. After 20 years in corrections, you die at 58. 1 in 3 of our employees had symptoms of PTSD. Over 90% were obese. Over 90% had hypertension or pre-hypertension. You can just see it's just overwhelming, that data. And so we knew we needed to do something differently. And so as we looked to other systems like Norway, who had healthy employees, who had an organization that was the most highly sought after government job, we knew that we had something to learn. We also knew that if we made changes for our employees, that it would have automatic positive impacts on those in our care and custody. So we started there. And truly, while the executive team set the vision, I think the most compelling thing that happened was an officer exchange with Norway, where Oregon Department of Corrections officers actually went to Norway, moved in with officers of their same rank, got to know their culture, got to work their shifts, and really learned from them. And then when they came back, we just said, the reins are yours. What ideas do you have? No idea is a bad idea. Let's just try and do something differently. And so we started with restrictive housing, and we had individuals work with folks who had been in restrictive housing, some of them for decades that we had given up on, really try to use the principles that they learned in Norway to hook some of those individuals and get them out of restrictive housing. And it worked. And I was a little nervous. Some of our officers wanted to start with our most violent, most mentally ill individuals. And I thought, oh, we're either going to throw the baby out with the bathwater here, or it's going to work and we'll make our way. And they made it work. And it had a profound ripple effect on our institutions in Oregon.
When you talk about restrictive housing, what does that mean exactly for people who aren't necessarily familiar with prison nomenclature?
Yeah, so restrictive housing, in our words, is a place where individuals are in cells, not in dorm settings, where some of their privileges have been restricted, either because we're concerned about them engaging in self-harm or concerned about them harming others, or they've engaged in actions that require some sort of disciplinary segregation or disciplinary sanction. And so for me, that's kind of the belly of any institution. And so if restricted housing is running in a humane and normal way, then the ripple effect to the rest of the institution just occurs. And so that's your toughest population, I guess, is how I would describe it. The most violent, most seriously mentally ill, and the individuals that are most at risk to hurt themselves or others.
Can you explain a little bit more? So these people they weren't as restricted, or they had more leeway, or it was less punitive. Will you explain that?
Yeah, I'll give you an example, just a really profound example. So we had this individual in our care and custody. I'll refer to him as Mr. G. And every time I went onto the behavioral health unit that he was housed in, it was very chaotic. It was loud. People were yelling. This individual was so severely mentally ill that he couldn't even engage in a conversation with me when I would go cell front. He spread feces, and he was a headbanger. And so when he did engage in spreading fecal material, we would have to cell extract him daily in order to clean out the wound from his headbanging. So horribly disruptive. He would absolutely wind up the entire unit. Our staff were working so hard, just one cell extraction after another, trying to calm this population down. And our officers who went to Norway said they wanted to work with him, and they did. And they went to the cell front and just said, we've got some crazy ideas. We just got back from Norway. If you stop swearing for the next 10 seconds, we'll make you a cup of tea. And I think he was just so shocked that he stopped talking. So it worked. And in little time, when these individuals worked with them, they found out that he was spreading feces because he was an artist. So they brought crayons in, something not at risk for safety and security. And he started creating this incredible, beautiful art. They found out he was a musician. Once he had calmed down and had engaged in positive behavior for a lengthy period of time, they brought him a good guitar. And this is an individual who didn't ever want to leave his cell. And so they slowly got him to leave his cell and go into this room that they had created. It was a nature room. It was, again, another small area, but there were murals throughout the whole area, and it was a more peaceful place for him to sit and reflect. And it changed his life. When you talk to him now, that's exactly what he says. He said to me, I can't believe you all gave me another chance. To which I said, I can't believe you gave us another chance, because it was just this cycle of him acting out and us engaging in cell extractions. And he really was the beginning of great change. And there are just examples after examples now in Oregon where individuals that we had given up on, that we thought would never be able to live a more normal life, are in fact doing that inside our prisons.
So what is Norway doing that we could learn from, other than working with individual prisoners? Do they have a different philosophy about incarcerated individuals?
They do. They believe that coming to prison is the punishment, the singular punishment. There should be no other punishment. So the environment that they're living in should reflect the community. And you can imagine, if that environment existed, it would be healthier for our employees and those in our custody. So it's an entirely different philosophy based in the principles of normalcy and humanity. And then the other thing that they do is train those employees. I told you earlier, it's the most highly sought after job. It also is one of the most regimented training courses I have ever seen. When you get hired by the correction system in Norway, you go to an academy for 2 years and you learn sound correctional practices. You learn how to engage with these individuals in a personal way, but not in a private way. So they establish what those appropriate professional boundaries are. They give almost a liberal arts education so that you understand people's backgrounds and diversity and cultures, so you can come to the table more informed on what their lives might have been like. And Parliament has recently approved a 4-year training program where these individuals actually receive a bachelor's degree before they go to prison. And so it creates a very professional environment with incredibly well-trained correctional employees.
Do you think that would ever fly here in this country, that kind of training, that kind of commitment to prison employees?
Well, I will tell you, it will be a song I continue to sing and talk to with members of Congress, because one of the things I was really shocked about when I came to the Federal Bureau of Prisons is that we only had 2 weeks of training when we onboard our officers here at the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And the research says that the average onboarding for law enforcement in this country is actually 21 weeks. So we fell really short from that number. And so it's my hope, no, to answer your question, we won't get to a 2-year academy or a 4-year academy. But if we're talking about 2 weeks, do we have an opportunity for growth and change and advancement? Absolutely. And so that's where I really think we need to spend our time advocating for more dollars to increase our training. And in the meantime, the Federal Bureau of Prisons is doing a great job rebooting old training programs that were set aside because of the pandemic and expanding them. So our vision, my dream would be to have our own training academy that really focuses on our employees from hire to retire.
What about compensation? Is part of the problem that these employees are not compensated enough and valued enough in our society?
Agree wholeheartedly. I think people have a misperception of what corrections is all about. They see Shawshank Redemption or Orange is the New Black, and they think guards. We don't hire guards. We hire law enforcement corrections professionals that we ask a lot of. They are mentors and guidance counselors and caretakers and officers, all wrapped in one. Teachers, we ask so much of them. And if we're going to ask that much of them, I think we need to train them and pay them appropriately. Plus, we're losing them to other law enforcement agencies who are now paying more, who have higher retention bonuses, higher recruitment bonuses. So it really has become quite difficult to not just recruit and hire, but retain the individuals that we have.
A federal women's prison in Dublin, California had an incident where the warden and several other employees were charged with sexually abusing inmates. How do you prevent that kind of egregious activity from taking place in the prison system?
Yeah, it's just egregious. I mean, you're just using the right word. You know, there's a power differential inside corrections that you cannot argue with. We are responsible for their food, clothing, and shelter. So for someone to violate that trust so dramatically, up to and including the warden, is just horrendous. And so how do you prevent it? You hold those individuals accountable and you send a clear message that that type of behavior will not be stood for at the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And then you train. We've engaged in a whole host of trauma-informed, gender-responsive training. We're trying to create a culture. Many of the women said that they didn't feel comfortable coming forward. So we knew we had to create a culture at Dublin so that the women in our care felt comfortable coming forward, as did the employees, so that we're creating that environment. So we've now established hotlines, so internal and external, so that people feel comfortable coming forward. But we really have to create an environment in all of our institutions where that is the case.
The Partnership for Public Service recently issued its annual survey of the best and worst places to work in the government. And the BOP, the Bureau of Prisons, ranked dead last among 432 agencies. I'm sure that wasn't very good news for you. And clearly you're trying to change that. But do you ever get discouraged? Because it is a huge, challenging role, and you have to change so much. How do you kind of keep going?
Well, as it relates to the survey, when you're at the bottom, there's only one place to go, and that's up. So we see that as a great opportunity. And my team keeps me going. I have an exceptional executive team, great team in the director's office. Had the opportunity now a few weeks ago to meet with all of our wardens in person, and I got to meet with them, many of them one-on-one, and hear their stories and their passions and their desires to make change. And that's what inspires me. In the last 10 months, I've been to over 20 prisons, and those are my favorite days because I get to just walk the halls and talk to as many as employees as possible and as many adults in custody as possible. And hearing their stories is so inspiring to me. And they're exhausted, hence the results of that survey. They were, like I said earlier, they were tired before the pandemic. And then we had them, as the pandemic was rolling out, had them figure out how to run this huge healthcare system scattered across the country and combat the pandemic while they're faced with overtime and augmentation. And it just created a really exhausting environment. So we have a lot of work to do. My team keeps me going. My family keeps me going. My family is so encouraging and supportive of this role. They feel like they're part of the mission. And so all of that together really keeps me going and keeps me excited about the opportunities.
I wanted to ask you about domestic terrorism. Are the people, Director Peters, who were involved in January 6th and other domestic terrorists, white supremacists, et cetera, are they generally put in federal prison?
They are. And so while I wouldn't be able to speak to specific cases like the January 6ers, what I can tell you is that is one big difference from running a state system versus running the Federal Bureau of Prisons, is that that's exactly individuals who are incarcerated here with us. And as you can imagine, they require a different level of safety and security and protections and those sorts of things. But the Federal Bureau of Prisons is well trained and prepared to house those individuals.
Domestic terrorism, as you know, is a huge issue in our country, especially now. And I'm curious if you have someone who has particular expertise in dealing with some of these individuals who are dead set on sort of destroying the government, or, who are steeped in racism and anti-Semitism and have committed hate crimes. What do you do with people like that once they're behind bars?
Yeah, it depends on the individual. It depends on where they are in their criminogenic attitude and our assessment of them. But to your question, yes, we have experts across the country, from psychologists to national gang experts to domestic terrorism experts, that work for the Federal Bureau of Prisons and help us manage what their case load is, or case management plan is going to look like. For many of those individuals, they're going to be in a very secure setting with very limited access to the outside for all of the obvious reasons. For others, we are able to engage in programming and treatment and help change their minds and attitudes while they are with us. That would be the hope for all of them. Unfortunately, I think for some of them that change and reform won't happen. And so we're ready and stand ready to house them in a safe and secure manner.
Well, Director Colette Peters of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, thank you so much for talking with us about your goals as Director of Prisons. And we'd love to check in and hear about your progress in the future.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciated spending time with you. Thank you.